Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm David Thomas and I'm going to be chairing this session. I spent most of my career at the UK National Archives and now I'm a writer and researcher. I recently edited a book on silence in archives with Michael Moss, and two of the contributors to the book, Stanley and Ira, will be talking today, and Susan, who helped me get the book through the press at the end of a rather difficult time, will also be talking. This is the third seminar in a series run by the British Records Association and the Institute of Historical Research on the theme of the shock of the records, archives and truth. And these are designed to address issues around the critical importance of safeguarding records as evidence of activity, decisions and strategy. I think we're living in an age when the issues of reliability of information have become ever more critical. On the one hand, we've got conspiracy theorists who are able to pursue their conspiracy theories by denying the truth of government information. They claim that the US government is covering up the existence of UFOs in our skies, Trump was cheated out of his election victory, etc. But on the other hand, we know that governments lie to their citizens. In the second of these seminars, Andrew Flynn mentioned the Hillsborough tragedy, and it emerged from the work of the Hillsborough Independent Panel that the South Yorkshire Police tampered with evidence given by their own officers to put a better gloss on their behaviour during the event. Add into this the increased awareness that much on social media can't be trusted, and we have a toxic situation where official information is increasingly disbelieved. Sometimes this doesn't matter, but as we've seen in the case of COVID, a refusal to believe government advice about vaccination has led to deaths. And many COVID victims in ICUs in England currently struggling for their lives are unvaccinated. In the first seminar in this series, Sir Richard Evans spoke about conspiracy theories and argued strongly that all government records should be preserved. David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, described the problems facing the US National Archives, a country in which there's a legislative framework for preserving government records, federal government records, but there is no similar framework for the preservation of the records of the Congress or the judiciary. He also observed that it's difficult for non-historians to understand that there will always be different versions of history and new questions to be asked. Lord Daniel Finkelstein, writer and government advisor, focused on his grandfather, Alfred Wiener. His life work was guided by his belief in the power of truth. Wiener collected anti-Semitic writings in Weimar, Germany, and tried in vain to persuade others to take seriously the threat that they represented. He moved to Britain with his collection in 1938. The Wiener Library played an important part in informing the US and British governments about Nazi ideologues and supplied evidence for the Nuremberg trials after the war. In the second seminar, Laura Miller discussed the vulnerability of archives. She raised concerns about the vulnerability of digital data to cyber attacks, the lack of effective legislation, and the threats posed by the big data companies. She argued for more humanities training in schools and for school children to be taught more about the importance of evidence. Anthea Sellers, who's Secretary General of the ICA, considered how computer technologies change the ways in which governments and public agencies capture, manage, and make available records and archives. She discussed the risks and biases inherent in digital records and described the benefits of computerization for enhancing and improving records and archives management. And the final speaker was University College London scholar Andrew Flynn, who described the development of independent and community-based archives. These collect records in a range of formats: textual, oral, song, dance, even landscape. They can develop alternative truths and different narratives from the official and conventional, and can mitigate the damaging effects of the absence of records of lived experience. Sadly, what they can't do is guarantee that justice will prevail. They can show truth, but not necessarily justice. In today's seminar, we're continuing to engage with these emerging themes. Our first speaker will be Ira Buenrostro-Cabab, who's a lecturer at the School of Library and Information Studies, University of the Philippines in Diliman. She will give an overview of the situation in the Philippines in the post-Marcos era and the various memories and views about this period. She'll also discuss the work she's done using photographs and how these are reactivated through listening to the photographers or the subjects of the photographs to capture the voices and experiences of people who were political prisoners during the regime. I just want to say a particular thanks to Ira. We all know what time it is in the Philippines. That's to say, it's the middle of the night. So Ira's a great hero of the evening. And I saw from the list of people who've registered that a lot of her friends from the Philippines have also registered. So a particular warm welcome to you all. The next speaker will be Stanley Griffin, who's a lecturer and Deputy Dean at the University of West Indies, Mona Campus, Jamaica. He's an archivist, cultural analyst and historian, and he'll be talking about colonial era archives and the archives of Rastafari and how archives which normally deal in text need to change to capture the history of what's essentially an oral culture. Finally, the final speaker is Susan Stewart, who is a philosopher, formerly of the University of Glasgow, which has published a lot on kind of archives and philosophy. And she's going to argue that to concentrate on post-truth is to lose our focus on untruth. And it's the propagandization of untruth, which has a greater significance for the destabilization of our customary modes of being. Finally, Sarah Tyke is going to be the moderator for this session. She was formerly Chief Executive at the UK National Archives and subsequently a member of the independent panel established by the British government to report on the Hillsborough football tragedy of 1989. She also chaired the Fund for International Development of Archives for the International Council on Archives. There's a couple of administrative announcements I want to make. I'm not going to explain where the fire exits are for obvious reasons, but first of all, can you please put the questions in the Q&A area and not in the chat area? I'm sure many people will put it in the chat area, but if you could try and put it in the Q&A area, it would help. And just to remind you, the next seminar in this series will be held in March on the theme of archives in times of turmoil, and details will be on the BRA and the IHR website. So over to our first speaker, Ira.
So hi everyone, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So good morning. Good morning from Manila. It's actually 2:10 in the morning here. So please pardon my my brain cells if they are not working efficiently as I would like them to. But thank you for the invitation. My name is Ira Rosa Cabab, and I'm from the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies. And thank you for this opportunity to share with you some portions of my work, which started during my PhD on photographs and memories during the martial law period in the Philippines under the presidency of the late Ferdinand Marcos in the 1970s and 80s. So my work examines the potential of photographs as performative agents of evidence and memory in building a people's archive. By using the case of the photographs taken during this era, this study demonstrates the reactivation and use of these photographs in the stimulation of memories that can contribute to a more nuanced discussion and understanding of martial law period in the Philippines. Martial law, or Batas Militar, was declared in the Philippines by President Ferdinand Marcos through Proclamation 1081 on September 21st, 1972, and was claimed by the Marcos government as the constitutional response to the threats to national security, such as simultaneous demonstrations, riots, and random bombings in the Greater Manila area. The formation of Marcos's concept of new society brought drastic changes in the social, economic, and political structures of the country, including censorship and controlling of mass media, arrest and detention of editors, journalists, political leaders, student leaders, and innocent civilians, and among other human rights violations committed under this regime. Even though the two-decade dictatorship had already ended decades ago, and democracy was already reinstated in the Philippines, this era is still highly contested, with the existence of different memory sites and commemorative activities that present opposing sides. especially that the Marcos family has returned or rather maintained its influence and political power, evidenced by the government positions that some of the family members have still been holding or occupying. Currently, the son and namesake of Ferdinand Marcos, the former Senator Bongbong Marcos, is officially running as president of the Philippines in the next national elections in 2022. Although the Marcoses left Malacanang more than 3 decades ago, their influence and stories are still imprinted in the pages of history, esteemed in various memorial sites and etched in people's memories. The representation of the years of martial law is addressed in different sites of memories. As you can see here, there are monuments, museums in their hometown in Ilocos, and even a mausoleum of Marcos's preserved remains kept for several decades before it was secretly buried at the Heroes Cemetery in 2016. On the other hand, there are also other memory sites such as the Wall of Remembrance at the Bantayog ng mga Bayani or Monument of Heroes, which honors the heroes and martyrs who fought the dictatorship. Different scholars have already argued that the dichotomy of the current collective memory or master narrative depicted in these sites mainly involve the Marcos myths, which are either pro or anti-Marcos narratives, and the people power revolution myths that deposed the dictatorship and led the post-dictatorial transition in the country. The tension arising from the opposing recollections and views shows the great divide in the public opinion and understanding of the Marcos era. As we have seen here, the dominant narratives in the national imaginaries are mostly centered on Marcos and as a people power revolution that ended the dictatorial rule. It can also be seen here that the manipulation of official memory rests on the hands of the powerful with sufficient agency and voices loud enough to be heard, whereas those in the margins remain marginalized. And I quote political analyst Rizal Buendia, they continue to live on the outskirts, on the peripheries, on the fringes of power. As archives will always have missing parts and silences, a people's archives, which according to Eric Catilar, will and should be able to truly serve the people and accommodate previously silenced voices. Building a people's archives entails the need for the archivist's acceptance of their power to discover, rediscover, and reconstruct. And at the same time, we should acknowledge that archivists and institutions are also instrumental in the marginalization of memories and narratives. As argued by historian Howard Zinn, traditionally, archives set the stage for the powerful and usually overlooked the powerless, further hiding the latter. This redefinition of archives being a living archive is established for the causes of truths, histories, and memories. This does not only contribute to historiography, but it helps prevent the probability of denial of people's rights, justice, representations, history, identity, and agency. More importantly, a people's archives is a growing and ever-evolving democratic space that continuously finds ways to fulfill its purpose and different possibilities as well as impossibilities. And these impossibilities, according to Verne Harris, are the many ways of contextualizing archives and urgently responding to the call of justice. I argue, therefore, that in accommodating more voices to uncover silences, more reflective approaches should be done to further contextualize not just available materials in the archives, but what is not yet available or preserved in the official archives that would customarily form the official and public memory and narrative. Photographs, being powerful tools for documentation and persuasion, are most of the time used only as accessories or supplementary resources to the more dominant textual records, especially in doing historical research. What we can explore here is the potential of photographs to be discovered and reactivated as symbols and vital vehicles of memories, historical consciousness, public awareness, empathy, and understanding. Photographs can be further used to question and understand the social conditions in which they were created and circulated. These social conditions are obviously not standalone situations as They are deeply interlaced with the lives and experiences of individuals and communities. In this case, the photographers and the subjects. So I searched for materials for my doctoral project years ago on collective and individual memories of the Marcos regime. I was able to meet some photographers and also survivors of the martial law era. And I began my search for different photojournalists who were either working for government newspapers or alternative media during that time. So I did my search around 2015 to 2016 until 2017. Luckily, during my fieldwork, there were some who were able to provide me some copies of their work. And many of them said that their photographs are just with them and not yet deposited or preserved in any formal archives. But alongside my actual concern of how to preserve these photographs, I was more driven to find out the stories of the creation of the photographs and the other stories beyond the frames of these photos. Listening to the creation of photographs unravels rich stories and historical consciousness, as well as humanistic dimension of archival theory and practice. Understanding photographs is not just an act of looking, but it is more of a social act of listening to the source and the affective relationships and impact these records have on people. As a co-witness and listener, I put myself in a situation where I did not aim to stand as an expert, but someone who would learn from this mutual experience. Listening to them was both a personal and historical experience for me because I am part of that generation that did not experience the Marcos regime or was too young to even remember what transpired during the EDSA People Power Revolution in 1986. I certainly did not have a clear idea of what was life like during that period. Now, as an archivist and as an academic who is co-witnessing, listening and striving to embrace the responsibility of doing the impossibilities of justice and contextualization of this historical era, I tried to fill these gaps and heed the silences of this time. So there are many angles and sides of this era that were uncovered and remembered based on the photographers' experiences. One said, photographers were under fire. The military had their eyes on them. However, there are also some who said that there was no violence during the martial law era under the Marcos regime. If you're not involved in anti-government or anti-Marcos activities, you would not be picked up. You're fine. Many also recalled everything was censored. If you're publishing, the pages had to be approved one by one. Sometimes they would ask strangers in the airport, especially foreigners, and then ask them to bring some rolls of films to Hong Kong, and someone would meet them to take the films. And one interesting and courageous act, one interesting story, was done by a photographer that whenever he would visit friends or relatives in prison, he would smuggle in a camera, though he knew it was dangerous. So he would snuck the camera in with the groceries, and this way he could take photographs inside the detention camp and use these photographs to raise public awareness regarding human rights and the situation of the political prisoners during that time. Being a former detainee himself, this photographer, Mr. Lito Ocampo, took photographs inside detention centers after he was released and became a full-time human rights worker and an accidental photographer. And as I said earlier, many of these photographs that are not yet preserved in an archival repository may have achieved their original or primary purpose of documentation, but the other segments of realities captured within the frames remained to be sidelined, leaving questions such as, where are the photograph subjects now? What were their thoughts and feelings then? And how do they express and represent their own remembered experiences? Sorry. And one of them is a former factory worker who was also tortured and jailed in 1982. He and his wife described the condition inside the prison, the clothes they were wearing during the time, and even the painful experiences that they had and the struggles even after his release from the prison. And these struggles were not necessarily political struggles, but mostly economic struggles that they have still been experiencing up to now. As I intently listened to the stories of creation, co-creation, and contextualization of the photographs, the participants were not treated as containers of information, but as important and empowered agents who would freely recall and let things be seen and understood in a new light. I was also fully aware that talking about their past and revealing parts of themselves with a stranger could possibly cause anxiety and discomfort. With that, I was more sensitive and tried not to ask a lot of questions to let them freely talk and reflexively situate themselves in the photographs and the context within which the photographs operate. So after our conversations, usually they would thank me and show their gratitude and for listening to their stories and for being concerned about their situation and their plight. So their stories are just some of the many, many stories out there that are still waiting in silence. There are still many gaps to be filled in, and these things may not be immediately resolved. This lack of finality likewise indicates the infinite possibilities and continuing responsibility of archivists. Listening to the memories and stories evoked by photographs can be employed in different settings to further challenge the status quo that widens the gap between the powerful and the powerless, to respond to the call of justice, and to protect the people from the increasing apathy and unresponsiveness to people's struggles. And finally, the act of listening is both a contextualization method and an act of bearing witness to the people in the margins whose voices are usually silenced. So thank you so much for listening. And also some more details can be found in the book chapter published in this book, Archival Silences, co-edited by David Thomas and Michael Moss. So thank you, and I'm more than happy to answer all your inquiries later at the Q&A section. So thank you, and these are my references. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Stanley Griffin, and I'm speaking to you from the Mona campus here in Jamaica of the University of the West Indies. And it is my privilege to participate in this discussion, and I'm grateful to David and colleagues at the British Records Association and the IHR for this privilege. I want us for the next few minutes to reflect on the theme that I've been asked to present on, about the noise of the silenced, the noise of the silence. And I want to argue that for us in the Caribbean, we basically have records with two sides, right? And since I believe I'm going to run out of time, let me give you the summary before I go off into the topic, just in case the inevitable may happen. So our archival history, our documentary history, starts with colonialism and is based on colonialism. In fact, most of our repositories, most of our national archives consider our colonial records as the basis of our documentary heritage. And so our records reflect at least two sides: the European, the colonizer, and the African enslaved, or the East Indian indentured, or the several other peoples who have been indentured and worked and spent their lives in the Caribbean. I also want us to think about the indentured or the enslaved as having been silenced, and in their silence, there are noises. And we're going to talk about how the silence of their noises is important for us when we think about how and what we consider to be records, especially records coming out of an oppressive regime that colonialism really was. Finally, I want us to consider how these silenced noises, how the work and the memory of those who have been sidelined, marginalized, silenced in official records can be included in historiography and archival documentation. So we're thinking about this issue of silence and noises, starting off with an experience that took place here in Jamaica right after independence in 1962. It happened in 1963. It was, so Rastafari, many would know Rastafari simply by their hair, made popular by Bob Marley and reggae music. And so as a community, it's actually Rastafari is basically a faith. And as a community, they're known for their peace-loving, living on the margins of society, especially at that time period, doing agricultural work and so forth. Long story short, as Ira said, it's in the book, Get Your Archival Silences book. It captures the experience of a society that is attempting to move away from enslavement, which was, abolished over 100 years at that time. Yet the conditions of life and the conditions of managing the society was still very much slave operated. And so the Coral Gardens incident took place in 1963 around Easter, and it is referred to as either the Rastafari community refers to it as the Bad Friday experience, as it took place on Good Friday in that year, that Easter weekend. And it had all the characteristics of a revolution within the slave time period. White oligarchy, those of European American extract, having money, trying to drive people off of land and wealth that was earmarked for what is now the tourism belt in Montego Bay area. It affected everybody with dreadlocks, similar to my hairstyle. I'm not a member, but yeah, I have that kind of hairstyle now. And because of the time period, we're thinking of a time period where, no internet, no WhatsApp, no, so anybody with this particular look, not knowing what would have taken place in the other side of the island, and the prime minister of the time making the declaration, bring them in dead or alive, hundreds of persons with either afros or dreadlocks or lock hair were affected, imprisoned, shaved, tortured, marginalized, and many still suffer the medical issue, health issues coming out of that experience. And so it created this stigma for the faith, for persons of the community, right up until this day. Interestingly enough, there is only one file on the matter at the National Archives. Don't want to get into the details here, but there is simply one file on the matter at the National Archives. And what will that mean? What are the perspectives in that one file say, reflect, have for those who are really marginalized? And so, Caribbean society started off as plantations. We were not meant to be the societies that we are today, right? We were, as I say, either you come here to work to get rich, or you were brought here to work for somebody to get rich. And so the entire society was very tense. Kamal Brathwaite, he recently passed, literary theorist, describes the structure of Caribbean society as creolization, particularly when there were two major groups, the whites as masters, those African descendants, or as enslaved persons, enslaved laborers. And so as part of the whole structure of the society, those British, the Dutch, the French, Spanish imposed their authority over the laboring masses who are African or Indian indentured. And so even in records, you found this power at play. The Europeans used the written word. One theorist even goes further and said the act of writing changed, they had the whole dynamic of memory by writing and paper and establishing formats that we consider to be the archival or the official document. They considered those written texts as truth. the diaries, the plantation logs, the slave registers, the wills, the blue books. And so the written word, the record, was used as part of the mechanism to suppress and keep the society in check. You could describe it that way. The African enslaved and those who were indentured when they were brought along to the region, they resisted. And while we are well aware and we're accustomed to the resistance being the overt, the rioting, the revolutions, and the covert, the day-to-day resistance, there was another form of record keeping that we don't consider as part of the record keeping structure. And those acts of performances, those songs, those dances, those rhythms, their stories, their dress, their language, their cuisine, their rituals, all form part of that resistance to the written word. And therefore, we still today have details of the experience of the enslaved passed down in song and rhythms and movement, but yet we don't consider those movements, those songs, those rhythms to be information carrying, but simply cultural expressions. And so I want us to think through and hopefully realize that for the marginalized in the enslaved society in the Caribbean today, the songs, the chants, the dance, the storytelling, the community gathering was the form of records for those for us. While the masters wrote their diaries, made their reports, jotted their observations as notes, and sent them off to the UK based on for the purposes of this conversation. As records of the time, we met, we sang, we danced, we had our being. And so the creativity of the gifted singer, musician, dancer, storyteller, community leader was central to the creation, dissemination, and preservation of information, as was described with pen and paper. And so we're still caught in the Caribbean with what I term the politics of memory. All our archives are very much paper-based. At this point, let's say 80 to 85%. We're still very much strong paper-based, still for the most part patterned after the old PRO, public PRO style, with some influence by the American Schellenberg, right? In fact, those fellows actually came to the region and helped set us up. So we're still very much patterned off that dynamic. And what is placed on paper in boxes and shelves around the back is considered truth. While the living rhythms that have been passed down over time via drums and music and food is considered noise. And so my time is running out. And so let me just wrap up. And so the truth is considered, the paper is considered truth. The rhythms still need corroboration. If you were to look at the National Archives, you would, on Rastafari, you get a sense that the entire community was all bad. There was nothing good. There was this need for the slavery era type of oppression and mandates and isms that still persist to this day, right? The records of the community being thing. And yet the community needed their own records. The community needed their own self-validation. And so they used their community archives, their community gathering, to resist what has been written in the and stored and made available within the National Archival system. And so what has been written is considered truth, is considered knowledge, while the voices of the margins, well, the memory of the marginalized is considered noise. And so Mervyn Allen, who's a literary, he comes from languages, says there is a dichotomy that we're still caught in, where we consider the written documentation as the principal source of historical knowledge, while ignoring all this culture, all this information that balances out, quite frankly, the written word for us as Caribbean people. First and foremost, We need to recognize the cultural as being information. Information for us is not just written. The songs that are sung have information value. We need to understand the performance is more than performance. It's information, it shares information, it preserves information. In fact, one of our theorists, Rex Nettleford, talks about it being enduring sources for our identities and for future creativity. And finally, we need to strengthen our archival infrastructure to allow for that documentation or tradition preservation. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm Susan Stewart. I would like to start, first of all, by thanking Stanley and Ira. Those are both very interesting talks. I have lots of questions for both of them, but that's not my role at the moment. Thank you very much to David Thomas and to Sarah Tyack for inviting me to participate in this evening's seminar. I'm going to start a timer because I have a dreadful habit of talking for too long. And I think it's possibly because I'm a philosopher. I'm going to do what a very sensible thing that Stanley did, which is start with the conclusion, which you've already got in effect from David. But I think that the introduction of this neologistic phrase post-truth has distracted us from untruth, and untruth is nothing new, but carried with it, unfortunately, has been a kind of guilt-freeness that's come with untruth, and that's heralded an era of post-shame, I think, which we in the UK can most clearly see in, I better not alienate half the audience, but most clearly see in our government's recent actions in relation to Owen Paterson, for example. And this post-shame, I think, can be most clearly seen where honesty, emotional continence and privacy have lost any of their social value. So I'm going to go to a paper. If anyone would like a copy of the full paper, please say, and we'll send it to you. I'm going to read a little. We'll see how far we can get. So in his book, The Adventures of Ideas, Alfred North Whitehead speaks of the senseless agencies which drive civilizations from the anchorage of their customary modes of being into periods of despair. I think this is a worldwide phenomenon at the moment, and there are all sorts of reasons for it. From the point of view of at least half the population of their respective countries, it is the senseless agencies that have driven Brexit and a Boris Johnson premiership in the United Kingdom, the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States of America, the re-emergence of the political right in Europe, Brazil, and the US, and the appointment, later rescinded, of Robert Mugabe as a World Health Organization Goodwill Ambassador. Having weighed anchor on an older order, such agencies have left in their wake disconcerting neologisms like fake news, alternative facts, and post-truth, and a resurgence of what used to be called yellow journalism. Though this time, yellow journalism is internet-born and dazzlingly fluorescent, I will argue that to concentrate on post-truth is to lose our focus on untruth, and it is the propagandization of untruth which has a greater significance for the destabilization of our customary modes of being. We've seen this clearly in Ira's presentation, where people denied that there was any wrongdoing under the Marcos regime. Okay, so this customary mode of being appears to have passed. We live now in the age of what Coney in 2019 calls the age of anti-enlightenment, where reason disappears behind bluster. But Hannah Arendt in 1961 wrote that we are only too familiar with the recurring outbursts of passionate exasperation with reason, thought, and rational discourse, which are the natural reactions of men who know from their own experience that thought and reality have parted company. The most obvious change over the last 15 to 20 years has been the exponential proliferation of information, misinformation, and disinformation, which overwhelms our senses and often confounds our reason. Yet people haven't changed in any essential way in this time. Deception, fraud, and self-aggrandizement have never been uncommon, but now advances in technology have made things easier in terms of access, anonymity, reach, and distribution, whether it's identity fraud, election rigging, or cryptocurrency marketing. We seem more willing to accept the modern mantra that we live in a post-truth world, yet this is naive and dangerous, for it carries with it the insidious effect of nudging us towards an incoherent feeling that truth is all relative, that we don't have to listen, that experts have nothing to tell us, and the belief that if we say something insistently enough, it will become the case. I will argue that the only sustainable notion of truth is one, with one exception, which we haven't time to go into, unfortunately, a very thin but everyday useful sort. When we speak of truth, we are speaking of a particular kind of knowledge, that is a knowledge in the form of an utterance or text that comes with assurances, yet it is the assurances which often prove problematic. They are problematic because we can either trust the assurances, that is, believe them to be true and leave the matter there, or we can question the assurances and so begin a regress of checking our assurances with other assurances, and then checking those assurances with others, and yet others, and so on, until we are either satisfied or exhausted. Now, there are a range of philosophical theories to which we might have recourse to help us untangle the thorny issues of how we determine and how we justify what we claim to be truths. These include, but are not limited to, correspondence, coherence, consensus, constructivism, and pragmatism. My own view is that we have a constructive pragmatist view, but we'll see how far we can get. The correspondence view is one which a lot of people will recognize. It is that truth is the conformity of thing and intellect. It assumes a realism that there is an external world of things and an internal world of intellect, and that this intellect is not mere perception, but also the ability to recognize a regularity in the occurrence of things. It is a rather naive conception of reality that there are things external to us ready to be captured by our intellects, and that our intellects play no active explanatory part. I better not deviate. So there is one piece of knowledge, though, that our thoughts have content, because our bodies are impinged upon by the outside world, in which we can have considerable faith. We might refer to this as a truth, but I'm referring to it as something which we can have faith in. And this is a kind of empiricism, and we can see this borne out in science and the history of science and ideas, from Pythagoras' geometry, Al-Khwarizmi's astronomy, cartography and mathematics, Copernicus's physics and astronomy, and so on, up to the extravagant but unfortunately completely unfounded claims made by Wittgenstein in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where he says, the totality of true thoughts is a picture of the world. I use the word faith because, much as we might hope it would be different, we cannot prove beyond all doubt that we do not exist within someone else's dream or within a virtual reality simulation. That we are not perceiving a deep fake and taking it to be true, like the slowed down Nancy Pelosi video or Bill Poster's rendering of an unusually candid Mark Zuckerberg. When Kellyanne Conway surprised the world with her use of the phrase alternative facts, it was clear she was playing a different language game from all those who would otherwise have described Sean Spicer's claim about the colossal size of the crowd attending the 2017 presidential inauguration as merely a falsehood. But this is precisely why language, truth, justification, and what count as determinants are not merely matters of correspondence. The language games that form the warp and weft of our social agency are forms of life, shaping our perspective, our social and intellectual engagement, and our expectations. They even shape what we hear and see, and even what we are willing to hear and see. So Contra correspondence theory, where the intellect and the world coincide, there is no pre-existing isomorphism between language and the world. A fact that was made abundantly clear by Tony Blair's fictive claim that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, and so on. But also by Hillary Clinton, who during her 2008 presidential campaign misspoke about landing in Tuzla, Bosnia, under sniper fire. So let's put correspondence theories to one side and take language games a little further to the consideration of a coherence theory of truth. A coherence theory states that the truth of any statement consists in its coherence with other specified, though sometimes implicit, sets of statements. Coherence is a standard measure within science, and when statements fail to cohere, they may be rejected, revised, or in extreme cases, provide grounds for a paradigm shift. We see this in the move from geocentrism to heliocentrism in cosmology, and even the move from classical Newtonian gravity to general relativity. As individuals, we hold a range of statements to be true simultaneously, that is, to cohere and not contradict one another. These statements can be: glass is fragile, caffeine is a stimulant, potassium is a neurotransmitter, and the number 44 bus takes me past the post office. We believe to be justified we believe all of these statements to be justified, and they cohere by and large with our other beliefs within a vast interconnected epistemic network that we think of loosely as all the things we know. It is this epistemic network which underpins and is reciprocally underpinned by our perspective, our language games, and our agency, which is another way of saying that we perceive our world, speak about our world, and act in our world in accordance with those things which we believe. Because these beliefs broadly cohere with one another, any challenge to any one of them will have a knock-on effect on the others, causing us to reconsider the veracity of other related beliefs. This is fine if the challenge is to something like the rerouting of a bus or the discovery that glass is now universally reinforced, but it has the potential for widespread epistemic disruption if the beliefs affected are those we hold particularly dear, like our political, moral, religious, or even scientific beliefs. So Bruno Latour in 1988 says, a sentence does not hold together because it is true. Right? There is no thing out there called truth. It holds together because, a sentence does not hold together because it is true, but because it holds together with other beliefs, we say it is true. So it coheres. It is because it coheres with other beliefs that we say this thing is true. What does it hold on to? He says, it holds on to many things. It has become tied. Its fate is tied to anything at hand that is more solid than itself. As a result, no one can shake that belief loose from everything else without shaking everything else. And yet the human desire for epistemic order is so strong that loosening even one truth can be emotionally expensive, and lessening the tethers on all the rest could be personally devastating. Quite literally untethering us from the network that constitutes our identity. So rather than loosen our truths, we work hard to pull together the disparate epistemic strands within some kind of narrative, one that carries with it a perpetual element of cognitive dissonance, which can cohere for our workaday purposes. But the sense of cognitive dissonance, I think, is the thing which is growing in our society. Karl Jaspers elaborates on this in his Psychology of Worldview. how elements of our worldview are strung together into stories which explain our origins, our relationships, our desires, why we do what we do, believe what we believe, value what we value, and why we also mistrust those who don't share our origins, relationships, beliefs, desires, and values. As our lives and experiences unfold, so too do our accounts of them. And since we strive for understanding and coherence, everything we encounter, even the painful and the absurd, must have a meaning within those narrative accounts. This remains true even when what we perceive appears to make no sense or contradict everything we hold dear. According to Karl Jaspers, each individual's worldview also contains elements of pathology with defensive strategies for resisting challenges to our beliefs, strategies for the suppression of competing accounts, and so on. One might imagine the cognitive dissonance felt by a Trump supporter in light of the US president's 16,000 plus false claims and his regular award of 4 and now bottomless Pinocchios would be too great to overcome, and that even the pathological strategies would break down at some point. But that would be to completely misunderstand a Trump supporter's perspective. We live within our own epistemic strongholds, listening to those who speak our language game and share our beliefs. And within those communities, there is a virulent confirmation bias with regard to the stories we hear and relate, and those stories we are willing to hear and relate. So the coherence view emphasizes three things. The first thing is that there is an explicit otherness. There is a they with whom we have a solidarity in our beliefs. We are also tacitly complicit in the setting up of those beliefs because we are part of that they, that larger social group. And there is a need for engendering epistemic virtues like curiosity, humility, and discernment in our inquiry and judgment. Otherwise, we remain within those little coherent groups. So let me just see. Okay, I've got 4 minutes. To tell the truth becomes, so language, I'm going to move to Nietzsche just very quickly. Language is a human invention, not communication, language. And Nietzsche says that to tell the truth becomes an obligation to use the customary modes of speech, the metaphors, he says, according to stable conventions. So those ones which cohere. But he does something which is unusual. He marries the correspondence and coherence theories. So he says, to tell the truth becomes an obligation to use customary modes of speech, those that cohere within our group. The obligation to designate something as red or hard or frightening becomes an expedient moral impulse. It is a moral impulse because it establishes an extensive epistemic network by connecting us with other users of the same language games. Reliability is established when they both correspond with what is perceived and cohere with other similar claims. And when they do that, their purported truth has a utility for that social group. It is when they lack either or both of these requirements that we know the moral impulse is absent. I'm going to skip down a little bit and come to the absence of that moral impulse. So when somebody says that they are, for example, a billionaire, but we know them to be a bankrupt, then they are not cohering with that, the utility of the term billionaire within that social group. Their moral impulse to use language in the appropriate way is absent. Okay, so just turning my timer off. So this allows for a certain kind of plasticity within language. So the true in our coherent society, our correspondent society, the truth within this pragmatic view has a plasticity. It has a temporally extended reliability, which depends on a culture's current best observations, technologies, and interpretations. When these improve or alter, the true is open to revision, just as when we moved from a geocentric view of the world or the universe to a heliocentric. At the level of gastronomy and nutrition, we experience this when advice shifts from drinking full-fat milk and eating butter, all good for calcium and growing and maintaining bone health, to reducing cholesterol by cutting down on fats, by switching to reduced fat milk and eating margarine, and then to avoid margarine because of the risks to our health of trans fats. Our world abounds with mercurial dietary advice. These truths are plastic. These bits of knowledge are plastic. They shift. So I'm going to skip down here. So that people tell lies is not new, that people use lies to further careers, to receive cash bonuses, to keep their corporate brand or industry afloat is not new, that people use the truth in propaganda is not new. In 1941, in Mein Kampf, Hitler says the function of propaganda lies in directing the masses towards certain facts, events, necessities, etc., the purpose being to move their importance into the masses' field of vision. Dominic Cummings knew this very well when he said, you must get them, Hitler says you must get them into slogans, make very short slogans. And Dominic Cummings knew this when he said, get Brexit done. Trump knew it with lock her up and make America great again. And Mao Zedong when he said, serve the people. The same is true of L'Oreal when they said, because you're worth it. Okay, I'm going to skip down here. What I'm recommending is that that there are two reasons why truth-telling matters to us. The first is that we connect truth with understanding, and improved understanding is assumed to correspond with stronger and clearer grasp of reality, though what that reality actually is anyone's guess. The second reason that truth matters to us is that we associate truth with the possession of a moral good sense. And the possession of moral good sense entails knowing what is true and acting in accordance with it. But that true is part of our moral integrity. It's our moral impulse to use the language appropriately. And I'm going to skip that about the intellectual virtues and come down to the bottom. The cries of post-truth drown out the concerns on which we should be concentrating. The totalitarian propagandization of untruth and the celebration of intellectual vice. Truth is a tricky concept at the best of times. It has been my intention to demonstrate that the only successful theory we have when dealing with truth is a socially constructed pragmatic account. One that would take into account Stanley's cultural expressions rather than simply the information bearing documents. One with which we are complicit, the socially constructed pragmatic account of truth. Untruth still thrives under this theory when people misspeak or use alternative facts, but there is no place for post-truth, for we are still using language with or without a moral impulse. The claims for post-truth are wildly exaggerated and provide a distraction from the real issues of the institution of totalitarian governments, environmental disasters, which increase in frequency and extent, pandemics enabled by our globalization, and so on. Finally, this proliferation of misinformation whittles at our ability to form and practice habits of epistemic discernment and undermines our faith that we, like most other people in the world, continue to inhabit a mostly reliable world. Over and out. Whew. Sorry about that.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Sarah Tyack. I'm not going to go into introductions because it'll take far too long. I'm in the position of being able to get my question in first because I see that we don't at this precise moment have any Q&As. So please participate and ask your questions. Anyway, if I can set the ball rolling, could I just ask all the panel to give a view on how concerned should we be about this total loss of trust in institutions? This relates both to Ira and to Stanley, who were referring to the lack of trust in the official record keeping one way or another. And obviously, it refers back to Susan and the problem of trust and coherence in our everyday and indeed in our political and archival lives. So over to you. Who's going to speak first? Stanley, are you going to have a go?
We try.
And then Ira maybe can have a go.
Good
and
question.
then Susan, you can have a go.
Yeah, so I think, and Susan kind of mentioned this, the idea of language, the idea of the archive is this concept of truth. And it being this pedestal of truth that has enduring continuous value for all society, all members of the society who ascribe to this archive as being the repository of their corporate, personal, and collective national memory. The challenge with trust is that there is always, I guess it boils down to the archivist having this responsibility to seek relevance, having that continuous buy-in. Each generation must see the value of the archive and the materials therein as relevant to them. And in that relevance, there is this connectivity to truth. What we have there is true representation of what was. The challenge for us in a post-colonial setup is that whether we care to admit it or not, the truth there was oppressive to us, right? At least from the context that I'm speaking of. So if, for example, we were attempting to do genealogy, in other places, church records, vital records would be the spot. For us, transactional records would be the go-to. Bills of sale, deeds, lands, simply because, or for parents, were property. Now, how do you equate now our humanity with a time period of their humanity being considered property? And so how do you reinforce a trust in systems that created records that were oppressive to persons who now must rely and must look up to those materials as truth and as representative and as memory of the present? It's a challenge for every archival institution, every archivist, every archival context, because the value of what we keep is not just for storage, as I tell my students, but it's for use. And that use is about saying that these materials are indeed, quote unquote, true. And we ought to trust and corroborate, if that's the word, validate, triangulate the truth therein. Sadly for us, I think there is truth, but we need to recognize it is only one particular aspect of that truth, not the whole truth, as we tend to kind of sell the archive as the repository of the entire truth. And let me stop right there.
Well said. Ira, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. Because tradition regarding truth and even authenticity of records, so usually the concept of authenticity is related to truth and even trust on the material or the record itself. So traditionally, archives or archival institutions are ascribed with authority to be the official repository of truth and what is official memory or what is official history. But inherently, the materials in the archives do not just contain the truth, but it's really about the trust and the wide acceptance that we give to the institutions that keep and even create these archival materials. So I guess just like what Stanley said earlier, it's really challenging for the archivist to regain the trust and also to build the trust, not only to the archival material itself, but to the institutions that actually hold or even hold and even create, let's say, the community archives or even institutional archives or even government archives. So I think that's why I related it to the concept of authenticity, because in archiving, our of course, archivists have limitations to check the authenticity. So we have different ways to check the authenticity, whether it was really created during this time using this kind of material. But then again, it would be difficult for us to really establish the truth just by looking at the inherent characteristics of these records, right? So what we can do is not just focus on the actual material or the actual archival material, but look at the actual process of obtaining this material and also look at how we can use it to enable the people or the wider community to put their trust on us, or even put their trust on the institution that actually collects or build the archive, or even the memory contained or represented in the archive. So I think it's kind of tricky. It's challenging, especially in societies like ours, because even though there are official repositories or archives and even museums commemorating what happened in the past, we cannot really tell them that this is the truth. And you cannot really tell the people that this is just the single truth, because the truth is definitely not linear. I mean, it has different layers and shades and colors. And you let the people decide what is truth for them, and how they want to be represented, or even how they want to be understood and remembered. So yeah, I agree with Stanley. It's real challenging and exciting at the same time, because I think this is a good time for the archivist to really build on that trust, and also to explore more areas and different mechanisms on how we can do these things.
Thank you. Susan, do you want to give us a thought?
I'd be rather anxious about saying that people can decide what is true for them, because I think that what I hope I've opened up is this concern for the notion of truth. There isn't a truth for people. There are those things which we believe, and there's this network of things which we believe. And I'd be slightly, the only notion of truth, I think, is a very thin one. So I'd be slightly worried about saying that, because what I was kind of suggesting, perhaps there is something which I would think of as a relativism. I'd want to back off of relativism, because, well, for all sorts of reasons. However, let me come back to something which I think is really, really important. Stanley was encouraged. Well, first of all, I think that we don't really lack trust in institutions. Right? I think what we have and what we need to adopt is a pragmatic view to institutions. And I think that's what Stanley was advising us to do, because Stanley was suggesting that we have these things we think of as information carrying, and then we've got these other things which we don't think of as information carrying. Now, what is information? Information is that stuff which is relevant to us, and that thing which we then can utilize in certain sorts of ways, because it speaks to our worldview. Now, what Stanley was suggesting was, in fact, the worldviews of an awful lot of people who live in Jamaica are not spoken to by those records. They are spoken to by other sorts of things. And then he said he wants those to be considered to be information carrying. Those other things would be extensions of the worldview. So rather than just there being this set of records that are kept in the National Archives, you've got something which speaks to more people. Now that, I think, would then allow us to think in broader terms of, here are other determinants, or here are other ways of justifying, of finding justifications within the archive, in the National Archive in Jamaica, for more people, because these will speak to more people. They will have more pragmatic value. And if you want to say that that's trust in the archive, well, it's because it's speaking to more worldviews. That's what I would say.
Right.
I'm getting a bit passionate there. Sorry about that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go to the questions now, because We've got a few. Thank you very much, participants. So we've got one that carries on this particular theme. So given that people from all sides of the political spectrum react with vitriol to challenges and presented evidence and records which contradict their deeply held and entrenched beliefs, what are the panel's views on archivists and archives' role in cutting through the distrust and establishing the relevance of archival records in the political discourse? This is following on, so please be brief. Who would like to have a go at that? Because it's back to archivists. Do we have a role in any of this, or do we just receive and make things accessible? Obviously, Ira and Stanley wouldn't think so. Stanley, do you want to give us a view? I mean, I think you have already in your talk explained that you think that the archives should or may or could do more to represent the communities which are not at present represented. But of course, that in itself is difficult because the national institution is a state institution.
Absolutely.
And, you know,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So, so you're right. I mean, what I say to students here in the Caribbean in preparing them for their future is the archivist isn't the expert that knows everything and knows what is indeed archival. What the archivist ought to know is to help a community recognize what is of enduring value for them and what are perhaps the best possible ways to assist that community in arranging and describing, making it available, and doing the preservation. The archivist ought to be as objective, yet as involved in the community to be able to identify, quote unquote, the archival as best as possible, regardless of the possible formats that that community would craft their archival arrangement to be. I also encourage, so we, as Susan said very pragmatically, we look at what has happened there in the UK with the National Archives and the Community Archives and Heritage Group, and the website Access to Archives. There's a hallway behind my window, so please forgive, where you could search literally both institution and community at the same time. In other words, a flattening out or an inclusive way of doing the pragmatic type of arrangement and description, providing access. In other words, we ought not to be, I don't want to say Jenkinsonian and say, take what we get. We ought to be so involved that we can assist the community, because quite frankly, you know, many people would not think what they're doing is of archival value. Yet, while they do not recognize the archival value of what they're doing, they still emphasize that this has to be passed down, and has to be passed down in culturally appropriate ways, not necessarily in boxes in a reading room according to the text of an archive, but in practice and in spatial practice. There are particular ways that they expect the passing down to happen. And it is the archivist, I think, who should empower that community to say, that is indeed archival, that is access, that is your quote unquote reading room. And these are the ways in which you can promote that.
Right. All right, here's one I think which is directed at others, but mostly at you, if I may. Can you comment on how records of oppression can be read against the grain to promote democracy or freedoms? To what extent is this part of an archivist's duty, or is it that of a historian? I hope that's something that's up your street.
Okay, I think there should be a collaborative effort or a close partnership between the archivists and historians, because as we all know, archivists are always, well, we have been expected to be neutral and to be always in the middle, that we should not be showing our political sides or even our own biases when we collect or even preserve materials. because we are there, we are expected to be there to just preserve the material so that the historians and other researchers can access them and use them for your own historical research. But nowadays, there should be a close part. Well, this is my take, and I think a lot of archival scholars and also practitioners, and maybe you would also agree with me, that there should be a close partnership between the historians and other researchers and practitioners and of course the archivists, so that they can provide a more open and free space for more discourses, rather than just staying there and passively wait and preserve materials. So I think as archivists, I think it's really important for us to gather these materials from different angles, from different views, so that you can provide better access and also materials for wider intellectual activities and discourses, especially regarding this contested eras of history. So I don't think it's just a responsibility of the archivist or responsibility of the historian, but I think it's a responsibility of both.
Right. I'm just trying to find one. Yeah, there's another one here, which is really for you, which is listening to photographs. When you are shown a photograph, how can you be sure it presents a truth rather than a distorted view of the situation?
Okay.
Difficult.
Okay. So this is actually, well, of course, I am using my memory studies lens and also my oral history lens and a framework that whenever your interviewee or the respondent present you information or their own memories or even the materials or artifacts that represent them or represent their past, you as the researcher or as the archivist should actually believe in them, or it's not really your concern to check whether it is valid or not, because it's really difficult to really check the validity of humans of human memory, right? I mean, human memory is the most fragile type of memory of all, but that makes memory studies more interesting, and of course oral history and even oral traditions, because the purpose of gathering these materials and even the stories or even the traditions, the orality, is not just because you want to check the validity or whether it's true or not, or correct or wrong, but what you want to see here is the different nuances and what these things can add to the existing narrative or to the existing beliefs of a certain community or a certain country. So in my experience, so when they presented is my photo, and of course I should treat it as such, like, okay, this is your photo, so thank you for sharing it with me. And then it's not just about the photo, but it's about the process of interviewing and the conversation that I had with them. Because again, as I said earlier in the presentation, looking at photos, it's not just about the gaze, how you look at it, but it's about how you actually do the social act of listening and relating to them and be more reflexive on doing this process.
Right, so you in fact become part of the record.
Yeah, because there is co-creatorship of records, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so you're reporting in a sense as well.
Yeah.
Okay, there's one in chat which I have located, and this is, I think, for everybody. Is there a place for archives and archival institutions in the preservation of falsehoods, or whatever you want to call them? I'm a bit unsure now what I'm supposed to call them, Susan, but misspokes and all the rest of it, I suppose, that were expressed in the past, or even now, because most archives have to deal with almost contemporary material. Or should we seek to preserve only what we perceive to be true? If there are conflicting missions here, how might archivists aim to reconcile them? Right, you can have a go at that, Susan, if you'd be kind enough.
They're part of our culture. Of course we should. Of course we should keep them. I think we have to be careful here, because truth and falsehood, these are, so I think, for example, that the world is not flat, or and I do think that the moon landings were real. I think of these, though, as I can say, quite thin, but partly because they're not things that I myself can go out and prove. I am taking the assurances of others, so I'm not doing what the Royal Society encourages us all to do, which is to go and check the things for ourselves. So I think those are quite thin notions. But we also can have thin notions of falsehoods, because some people might think that the world is flat is a falsehood. Now, yes, I think we ought to keep these records, and I think we ought to preserve what these people think. It's conspiracy theories, all of these kinds of things, because these are really narratives that are part of our being human. Yes, of course, I think we should keep them. And I don't know how you determine. I mean, I think that everybody's sort of touched on this already, because I'm not an archivist, but you guys are, and you know that you cannot help but be prejudiced.
Do the archivists amongst us wish to make a comment?
Yes, do.
Stanley, do you want to say?
I fully agree with Susan. I believe that archives were meant to preserve and present to future generations the byproducts of human activity in its broadest, widest, quirkiest, all its lovely fullness. And whether they are falsehoods or not, if, according to the mandate of the institution, I mean, every institution can't keep and create, can't provide access to, collate and provide access to everything. But surely if there's a group out there of, enthusiasts who are into collating and arranging and describing falsehoods, absolutely. Our world or science or arts or humanities have developed with this this counterbalance, hasn't it? Where there is truth researched and found to be truth, and falsehoods that have been figured out to be falsehoods. And so who's to tell? I mean, a repository of falsehoods will do the future well, perhaps. I think if it is possible for some agency or community to do that, who knows, it ought to be done.
Lara, do you want to make a comment, or are you happy with what's been said? Ira?
Yeah.
You don't have to, I'm only asking.
Yeah, my answer is the same with Susan and Stanley. You just keep those, and even the falsehoods, or even how truthful a certain material is, they're part of the entire context of that record or particular context, right? So
good. I've got a question here for Stanley, and the questioner says oral histories, dreams, rituals are repeatedly left out of official state and colonial archives, which you indeed showed us, Stanley. To call songs noise is dismissive, of course. However, to call them a source of information seems to reproduce certain premises of official archives. Doesn't the idea of noise destabilize the very foundations of colonial rationalities? This is even more a problem of coherence, maybe, but it's up to you, Stanley.
Yeah, I'm not too sure colonial rationalities. So the theory the idea of silence and noise came from a culturalist. She is actually, she comes out of literature from our University of the West Indies, Caroline Cook. And she argued that in one of the first texts that really looked at what was termed the vulgarity of Caribbean culture, is that in spite of all the oppressions that would have taken place, think of 300 to 400 years of oppression, enslavement, and so forth, that there were noises in the system that had to be released. She entitled the book Noises in the Blood. And those noises are released from the body in ways that the hegemonic society, i.e. through the colonial lens, referred to as vulgar and crass and rude and so on and so forth. And in her work, she argued that what society considered and affirmed to be appropriate was considered knowledge, and any other form of epistemology, any other form of knowledge, creation or expression was noise. And why I stuck with that, because at one point in my life, I lived in Haiti. And in rural Haiti, when there were gatherings, for whatever reason, the drum and dance and chants and songs were a part of it. Now, if you did not know the language, if you did not understand the movements, if you were not quote unquote culturally literate, it actually sounded like noise, right? And so if you don't understand the knowledge, it is noise. And so the colonial structure of records, it starts off with us learning ABCs, how to construct a sentence in the English language, how to write, right? And that happens in the official space of learning, what is referred to as the school. But yet for us in the home, there are these stories, these songs, these sayings, these movements that we're also taught to learn. Yet officially, we're not supposed to practice that outside of, in other words, there are two literacies that are taking place amongst us. And even right here at the university, we're still trying to come to terms with how do we deal with our home language and the official languages that colonialism has thrown on us. So in other words, I wanted to show in the book that what the Rastafari and other such similar communities are doing, they're simply expressing their knowledges in ways that the community considered to be noise. The official repository, because they have not been resourced or empowered to validate that noise as knowledge, it will remain noise. And it's been only a few years ago that we recognize the noise as having cultural value. The tourists come for it, we celebrate it at the festival, but we do not recognize it as a form of knowledge, a knowledge that is being created, that is being expressed, that is being preserved, that is being passed down. And so using that theory where they're being silenced by the records, silence meaning you're marginalized, and at the same time you're being noisy, right? You're not passing on information, you are not knowledge, you are therefore marginalized and keep your noise to yourself. And it is for that reason, literally, we still have colonial laws on the books, banning drums, banning certain religious expressions, banning certain forms of dress, right? The noise that colonialism has silenced and marginalized is still haunting us today. And our record keeping official archival structure is still very much colonial. I argue that it is the last bastion of colonialism. We have our own national anthems, we have our own songs, but yet we're still behaving as if Jenkinson and Schellenberg and whatever comes out from National Archives Q is the official. And I'm being very serious, because right now, without it being too detailed, we're rethinking how we do archives, and yet our policymakers still take trips to the UK, Canada, and US to affirm some of the policies that they're trying to institute. Policies that were not created for our context. Policies that will still consider our records to be noise. And so, pardon the excitement, but I find it highly annoying and totally disrespectful to ourselves when we claim to be independent, we claim to have our own sense of identity, yet in our own record-keeping structures, we maintain practices that were used to oppress us.
Well done, that man.
Told us a few truths there, Stanley. Ira, do you want to say something, or are we, I'm looking at the chairman. Am I supposed to be letting you speak, co-chair?
I'm good. It's 3:30 in the morning. I feel a bit sleepy
Thinking
now.
about the time. That's all. So
Yeah.
are we going to you know,
I think we should probably wind it up there, Sarah, if that's
that's
okay.
all right. It was, I think Stanley gave us a rousing crescendo. Thank you very much.
I was going to try and summarize, but after Stanley's talk, I don't think I need to. I think it was so wonderful. I think you said anything that I would have wanted to say and a million times better. So thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to thank all the speakers for a wonderful occasion and for Sarah for chairing it so well. And also to thank Amanda Engineer, who we can't see, but she has organised this and kept us all in order and made the thing happen. So we need to thank Amanda as well. So that's great. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. And I thought it was really, you know, and what was so pleasing is that somehow everybody is trying to get towards the truth. The idea that sometimes you read about from the kind of postmodernist point of view, there isn't a truth in archives and they don't tell us some truth about our past and our lives. Nobody's taking that line. Everybody is somehow struggling and it's difficult and it's, you know, it's hard, but in the end, we are all trying to get towards the truth. And I think that was really what came out for me of today's discussion. Just a couple of things. First of all, a small advertisement. This seminar was organised by the British Records Association. It is a charity which is concerned with preserving records and putting on sessions like this, and it publishes a very good journal called Archive. So you might want to join the British Records Association. I'm a member and I get a lot of value out of it. And finally, yeah, thank all the speakers, especially poor Ira, who desperately needs some sleep, I suppose. I was going to end by showing you all something. So this is particularly, I'm afraid, aimed at people in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland who've heard of a pub chain called Wetherspoons. This is a chain which is very much aimed at the older demographic, elderly chaps who like to drink beer, basically. But on their monthly magazine, this is the page of their monthly magazine, which says, "Does truth matter?" So clearly these issues are being discussed all around the world, as well as just here. So thank you all very much, and see you at the next session, which is in March.